Hey guys, Zom Fox here, and today we're going to be talking about the UFL TV ratings halfway through the 2024 season. We are now halfway through the season, and we can officially look at the TV ratings and actually kind of judge how well or how bad they're doing. Now, as you can tell by the title, the TV ratings are actually pretty good. Unlike the attendance video I did a couple days ago, overall, most of the stuff we're going to be talking about today is positive. Now, there are some negative things to get to. There were a couple games that were disappointments, and this past week was a bit bad. But overall, the TV ratings have been really solid. We're going to go over exactly how good they are, how do they compare to the USL and XFL last year, as well as what can actually be done to improve them, and why is there a lot of concern over the next few weeks. So we're going to quickly be going over just what each game got in terms of TV ratings throughout the year. But before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed this video, as over 60% of people watching this video are not subscribed. So without further ado, let's get started. Now, week 1 of the season, we saw the kickoff game of the Stallions and Renegades end up getting a 1.18 million viewership. Then we saw the second game actually outperform that by hitting a 1.35 million. The Battlehawks Panthers game outdoing the Stallions Renegades was a massive surprise in a very good way. We expected the Stallions Renegades to be the best game in terms of the entire regular season viewership wise, and instead it looks like it's going to be the Battlehawks Panthers. That was a very, very good sign. And the two ESPN games on the Sunday, on March 31st, you had the Defenders Brahmas hit 0.96 million, and you had the Showboats Roughnecks hit 0.70 million. Or 0.7 million. These were really solid numbers to hit, especially for a cable channel, is that these did a lot better than many games did on ESPN and the XFL last year. So that was a very solid week 1. Then week 2 continued it, as we had another ESPN game hit over that 0.7 million, with the Brahmas Showboats hitting 0.72. Then we had the Renegades Battlehawks, the first primetime game of the season, hit 0.91 million on ABC. Now, that is a bit of a disappointment, but at the same time, these first couple of weeks were going basically head-to-head with the NCAA tournament, which is the biggest juggernaut you basically can face in all of sports. But then you had the game on ESPN do a 0.9 with the Stallions Panthers, which was, again, another massive success. And then you had the Roughnecks Defenders game hit a 0.85 on Fox, which is overall still a very solid number. Now, in terms of week 3, we see the Defenders Renegades hit a 0.53 on ESPN. That is the lowest game that is not on FS1 that we've seen this entire season to this point. And it is a pretty low number, but we'll get to it later. That's really not that bad a number. Then we had the Showboat Stallions game on primetime as well. That one hit a 0.84 million on Fox. And then we had a couple ABC games, with the first one being the Roughnecks Panthers on April 14th, which hit a 0.97. And then we did have a game overcome the $1 million view mark, with the Battlehawks versus Brahmas hitting a 1.02 million. That was a very solid ABC showing, as the Battlehawks and Stallions have been basically two of the biggest draws of the season. So seeing the Battlehawks hit that insane mark was not surprising, but was a very good sign. Now, we once again saw them hit a really solid mark, again this time at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Standard on April 20th, as the Showboats Battlehawks game hit a 0.95 million on ABC. Now, that night we had the first regional broadcast of the UFL, with the DC Defenders Birmingham Stallions game taking place at the exact same time as the Panthers Brahmas game. Now, this is very important to note. That game had a 45-55 distribution. 45% of the country saw the Stallions Defenders, whereas 55% saw the Brahmas Panthers. They combined the ratings, and the overall combined ratings was 950,000. Now, that is in part due to, you had the Birmingham Stallions game have the lightning delay, and they don't count the FS1 rating, so this was the overall rating. Then we had the lowest performing game of the entire season, what most people expect to be the lowest performing game. At 240,000, you had on FS1 the Renegades versus Roughnecks, the Tank Bowl. Both these teams are 0-3, and nobody really was a big fan of either team because of that. And so seeing it hit as low as it did was not a shock at all. In fact, the 240,000 you could even argue was a good number when you compare it to some of the other marks the USFL hit last year. And then finally, with week 5, the second of the regional broadcast and the first games of this week, you had the Stallions Roughnecks as well as the Brahmas Renegades. This was not as good, a 0.78. Now, the big reason for that was they decided to do an 89-11 split. The Stallions Roughnecks were shown to 89% of the country instead of it being more 50-50, and that game was a complete blowout at the second quarter, and it didn't get switched over until basically when the fourth happened. So the Brahmas Renegades ended up only being shown to, a very few amount of people, and so we definitely lost a lot of viewership because of that, having the Stallions Roughnecks be across the country and it being a blowout. Now, the Battlehawks Defenders, some people will try to tell you it was a blowout. Technically, yes, in the final score, but as the actual game, it was not. The game did not get out of hand until the fourth quarter. That is when the Battlehawks made it a blowout. So for 3 quarters, this was a very tight game. In the end, it had 690,000 on ESPN, a very solid number given that it was cable. And in the final game to talk about is the Panthers Showboats, which on Fox did 0.73 million. which kind of mixed about it. You had a lot of, NBA playoffs, NHL stuff, but in reality, it's just that it was on Fox at 3 p.m. with two teams and was the most forgettable game, but overall, it did 730,000. So those numbers are, they're numbers. What do they exactly compare to? Well, let's just compare it week by week by going to the week that is equal to basically where sports were. Now, during the season, I had been doing it based on the week of the season, so I'd be showing, the week 1 numbers for the USL and XFL versus UFL. This time, I'm going to be showing you about basically the same time chronologically. That means that this UFL week was going against the Elite 8, just like the first week of the 2023 or the 6th week of the 2023 XFL season. So comparing it like that, we start to see that the XFL numbers did, despite it being week 1, overall a bit worse than the UFL did. We saw the ABC numbers be over 1 million with the Dragons versus Guardians, which is a very good sign for them. But then the FX number and ESPN2 number both were at 0.37 million. Now you did have the Brahmas Renegades, which did also kind of tank, as you had a 0.75 million on that one. So overall, the UFL did outperform week 6 of the XFL. Yes, part of that is it was the first week of the UFL, and part of that was also not having games on FX and ESPN2, but also because the XFL last season had games on other days besides Saturday and Sunday, which also hurt its ratings. Now, going into week 2 of the UFL, you compare that to week 7 of the XFL. It had an FX broadcast of 0.18 million. Goes to show you that that FS1 number really isn't that bad when you put it into context. But in terms of April 1st, you had the Brahmas versus Vipers on ESPN2 do 0.36 million. Then you had an ESPN game with the Defenders and Guardians only do 0.37 million. And then finally, the Battlehawks Roughnecks did 0.5 million on ESPN. During this time, the XFL also kind of changed a lot of broadcast stuff, whether putting it on better channel or different times, which also could have affected the ratings in both negative and positive ways. But again, comparing it to the UFL, just comparing the cable games, the ESPN game low for week 2 was 0.72 million, which far exceeds the 0.5 million best that the XFL had in week 7. Then we get into week 3, and when you compare week 3, you look at the XFL week 8. The first game between the Vipers and Battlehawks ended up hitting a pretty respectable 0.87 million on ESPN, but then the Renegades Guardians following it went down quite a lot to a 0.68 million. Now, you did have the Roughnecks Brahmas game hit a 1.01 million on ABC, and then finally the Defenders Dragons in primetime on ESPN2 at 0.49 million. This is one of the closer ones. The fact is that overall, when you consider the fact that UFL had 3 games on over-the-air networks and were only able to do kind of a bit better than the XFL, it is a bit of a downside. But again, the ESPN game did do better than an ESPN2 game on primetime. You can debate which is better. But the ABC game hitting 1.01, again, you had a 1.02 in the same time slot of 3 p.m. with the Battlehawks Brahmas. Very similar, kind of wishy-washy. Now we get to the first USFL week, as week 4 of the UFL happened at the same time that the USFL had their kickoff week for the second season, and the 2023 XFL's week 9. Now the USFL had 2 games that averaged 0.86 million on Fox. Then on Sunday, you had the NBC game that was 0.97 million, and the FS1 game at 0.48 million. As for the XFL, you had the ABC game hit their 0.88, ESPN2 game having a pretty bad 0.24, which matches the bad FS1 number for the UFL, and then their 2 ESPN games had a 0.67 and 0.57. So when you compare it, the UFL did far better than either of them, especially considering the fact that the USFL was in their first week, and yes, I get it, they had competition with the XFL, but for the USFL having their week 1 of their second season to get basically just beat overall compared to the UFL, very good sign. I say basically because, again, you did have the FS1 game do significantly better than the FS1 game for the UFL, but you had 3 games, well, technically 2 time slots, but you know what I mean, average 0.95 million compared to 3 games that had 2 that were under it. But again, very solid showing for the UFL there. And then finally, you had the week 5 go against week 2 of the USL and week 10 of the XFL. XFL week 10, you saw the Dome game between the Guardians and Battlehawks at a 0.76 on ESPN. You had the Defenders Brahmas at 0.83 on ABC, then a 0.4 for the Roughnecks Renegades on ESPN, and then the Vipers Dragons 0.38 on ESPN2. Now at that point, the fact is almost all those games did end up mattering because of, different tiebreakers and all that, except I believe the Dragons, Vipers ended up not mattering, same with the Renegades Roughnecks, but heading into the week, all the games mattered. It just was after certain games happened, it changed. As for the USFL, you saw the USA game do a pitiful 0.13 million, 130,000, and the Panthers Stars final game of the week in primetime, no less, do only 210,000. Now, you did have the Fox outdo NBC at 0.8 versus 0.73, but compared it to the UFL, who despite the blowouts and issues still had a 0.78 with the first 2 regional games, a 0.69 on ESPN, and a 0.73 on Fox, which gives it the edge. Now, what does it overall compare across the entire season? Now, looking at it across the entire season, I decided to use a different graphic for the USFL because that also shows what they averaged on in 2022. And when you look at it, you realize the UFL is actually doing very well. When you compare the ABC broadcasts, ABC on the UFL is currently averaging basically a million people versus the XFL, which did average 1.1 million. So the XFL is beating it there slightly. Now with ESPN, that edge gets overtaken or replaced because the XFL had 0.7, whereas the UFL had 0.8, basically 700 and 800,000 respectively. So right there, you're basically tied. We haven't had an ESPN2 game, so we don't know what to do, but there's only going to be one. Just like there was only one FS1 game on the schedule, so even though it's 200,000 versus the USFL, which had 280 in 2022 and 307 in 2023, it was only one game, so yeah. But the big one is the Fox rating. The Fox rating is so far averaging a million viewers per game. That is compared to the USFL in 2022, which had 886K, and then in 23 only had 726K. So Fox currently, if they're able to keep up the pace that they're going with, Fox is going to pretty much obliterate what they put up last year. And overall, when you look at this is still overall improvement over last year. Again, the FS1 number is far down, but there was only the one game on FS1. When you look at what ESPN, ABC, and Fox are doing, they're either basically competing and averaging almost the same or higher than either league did last year. And when you consider how many of these games are on ABC, ESPN, or Fox, it's a really good sign. So overall, the ratings have been very solid. Now, they're not incredible, but they're really solid, especially when you also consider the fact that, the spring football newness is fully gone at this point. Very solid ratings overall. Now, speaking of the ratings, what is the big deal about them? Well, we talked about this in the attendance. The big one from the James Larson tweet about the financial tidbits is that Fox and Disney have booked about $3.7 million in ad sales through the first 8 weeks. We don't know if that's been updated. This was a few weeks ago, but at least until week 8, they had basically gotten $465,000 a telecast. Now, this number is important because of the question of exactly what was the UFL selling? What were they selling in terms of the average attendance they expected to have? That is a big deal because if the numbers have exceeded what the UFL thought they were going to have and advertised, legitimately, we could see that number go up to more like 480, maybe even 500,000 a telecast. And that's why the TV ratings are so important. The better the TV ratings are, the more expensive having those, ads slots will be. Instead of being, 6,570, maybe make them go up to 6,750 or maybe to 7,000. So as long as the numbers are doing better than what they expected to be doing, that's a very good sign for the league in terms of potential financial success next year or for the last 2 weeks of the season. Now, going into what can be done to improve the TV ratings, this one is a bit different than the attendance. The attendance was pretty simple as you had 3 pretty massive issues. This is more of there's 3 things you can do that are pretty obvious. Well, 2 of them are to improve it. The first one is the same season start date. I mean, this is simple. Just keep kickoff basically the last week of March / first week of April and do that as your kickoff date. Keep it the same so people understand, ahead of time when it's going to start. Just like how when the MLB is going to start, when NFL is going to start, when hockey and basketball start. Very important, so keep the same date. Next one is going to be national advertising during the NFL CFB season. Look, again, we know that the league's going to do this. It's just that they physically couldn't last year because of the fact that the merger didn't get finalized until January when it got officially announced. And they did try to advertise, after it got finalized and all that. But naturally, having ads during, the NFL season as soon as really week 1, that would be a very good thing to have, especially at least after about week 10. So if they're able to do this next season, which I expect them to do, will be very good in getting more eyes on the league. The more people who see ads for it, naturally the better. So that's a very big thing. But then the last one is the one that's a bit different, and that's local marketing. Now you may be shocked at me saying this again, but it actually does prove to be a big deal in terms of the TV ratings. Fox recently put out their top 10 local markets for the first 5 weeks of the UFL season. Now these numbers are purely based on the Fox games, so yes, certain teams being on Fox versus not affect these in a decent amount. But overall through 5 weeks, we've seen a couple teams which you'd expect, Birmingham, St. Louis, Detroit, San Antonio being up there, Memphis. But what you'll notice is you'll see cities like New Orleans, Tulsa, Kansas City, Louisville, and Columbus up there that do not have UFL teams. And in some of these cases, don't have a basketball, baseball, or a hockey team. Now, Columbus, they do have a hockey team in the Blue Jackets, but they don't really have anything else. Then you have the same thing with Kansas City. Kansas City has a baseball team, but they don't have a basketball or a baseball team. Or, not baseball, a hockey team. So these cities that have fewer sports overall, like New Orleans is another one, they may have a team, but they don't have a ton of teams. The fact that they're doing this well shows potential expansion ideas. New Orleans, I recently put out a community post talking about it. Again, shows that the Breakers need to return, but what it also shows is that you can market to local areas or local cities that don't necessarily have, all three or really even two of those, three sports leagues, whether it be the MLB, NHL, or NBA. And you can get those people to grow and watch the UFL to hopefully get an expansion team down the line. That would be a very good way to improve those local marketing and get your TV spaces up, because again, when you're seeing about half of all the top 10 markets being cities that don't even have a team, it's a very good sign. Now, the one thing that is a bit negative is the potential future TV ratings for the rest of the season. Look, we're through halfway the season, and unlike the USFL and XFL last year, which, while we did know a team or two would probably miss the playoffs, we pretty much know already what 4 teams are making the playoffs. Now, there still is an outside shot for the Defenders to make it. They'd basically have to go like 4-1 the rest of the season, with their only loss being against the USFL team. And if the Panthers lose out, Showboats or Roughnecks could overtake them. But for the sake of argument, you basically know the Stallions, Panthers, Battlehawks, and Brahmas are making the playoffs, with the Defenders being a distant 5th. So it's going to make a lot of games just uninteresting, especially considering the fact that 2 of the biggest matchups don't happen till week 10. That's the second Stallions-Panthers and second Battlehawks-Brahmas game. Well, yes, those 2 matchups could end up determining the home field advantage for the first round of the playoffs. They also could be just like the Stars Generals in 2022 or the Roughnecks Renegades last year, where they end up not mattering and are just a precursor to the playoff game. So 2 of your biggest matchups aren't until week 10, and even then they might not be important. Now, you do have the big week 7 matchup coming up with the Stallions and the Battlehawks, which is a massive game. But overall, a lot of the big matchups have already happened. You already had the Panthers play both the Brahmas and Battlehawks. You've already had one of the Battlehawks Brahmas. So you've got 2 big games involving the Battlehawks, and that's basically it. Now, yes, if the Defenders are able to pull off the upset this upcoming week against the Brahmas, that'll make the rest of the season in the XFL conference a lot more interesting. But at least on paper, we are very skeptical on the TV ratings and how they're going to be. A lot of games could become potential blowouts, and a lot of games might not end up mattering. But we'll see. Overall, this has been Zomfox. If you enjoyed this content, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell to be notified as soon as I upload any videos, as I upload at least 4 videos a week about the UFL, as well as 1 short every week. And if you've been a fan of the channel for a while, think about becoming a channel member for as low as 99 cents a month. You'll get a bunch of exclusive perks and an exclusive non-UFL sports video every month. And as always, have a great night.